You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to episode 383 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. We have some really exciting projects afoot at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. One of those exciting projects is the work our architectural preservation team and curators are doing to get the Williamsburg Bray School open for your visitation. Now, if you'll recall from episode 331, the Williamsburg Bray School is the oldest existing structure in the United States that we know was used to educate African and African American children. Now, as we prepare the Bray School for you to visit and see, we're having many conversations around the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation about the history of the school, its scholars, and early Black American history. And during one of these fascinating conversations, my colleague Brandon Hewitt discussed how much he loves the research and work of Kevin Dawson, who is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Merced. Now, I loved our conversation with Kevin back in episode 224 because I learned a lot about an area of early American history that I didn't know about prior to our conversation with Kevin, and that's African and African American aquatic culture. Using details from his book, Undercurrents of Power, Aquatic Culture in the African Diaspora, Kevin revealed information about the African diaspora and how it brought African peoples to the Americas and the Caribbean, why it's important to view people as working, living, and operating on both land and water, and the ways in which water featured in the lives of African and African Americans, and how their water cultures impacted the development of colonial North America. This was really a wonderful conversation, and one I think you'll enjoy revisiting. But first, before we revisit with Kevin, this is the very last episode in which I'll ask you to fill out our listener survey. This listener survey is really important because this year, 2024, marks the 10th anniversary of Ben Franklin's World. The Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios team and I would really love to hear from you about what you think about this podcast, whether you'd like to see new types of episodes or perhaps video episodes added to our lineup, and what we can do to improve our service to you through this show. So please tell us what you think. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/survey. That's benfranklinsworld.com/survey. And now, let's go revisit with guest historian Kevin Dawson. Joining us is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Merced. His research interests are in Atlantic history, early American history, and the African diaspora. He's the author of several articles and a book, Undercurrents of Power, Aquatic Culture in the African Diaspora. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Kevin Dawson.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Kevin, I know you're here to talk about aquatic culture in early America, but before we begin that exploration, I wonder if we could first talk about the African diaspora. It's an event that's really central to your work and our exploration, plus it's an event that's really central to the history of early North America and the broader Atlantic world. So, would you tell us a bit about the African diaspora, why it occurred, and when it took place?
Yeah, so the African diaspora is this massive dislocation of two peoples, right? So you have indigenous Americans who are forced off their land to make space for plantation slavery. And then they're replaced by enslaved Africans who are obviously forcibly transplanted across the Atlantic to really make the New World profitable, to produce capital. And so the African diaspora traces the movement of Africans and their culture out of Atlantic Africa and into the New World, and examines how slaves recreated and creatively reimagined discrete ethnic traditions, and then also how they synthesized traditions belonging to different ethnic groups to provide themselves with a sense of cultural continuity and familiarity in the New World. And so I really began the African diaspora in 1444, when the Portuguese first sailed into sub-Saharan Africa and kidnapped Africans into bondage. And then I would argue the African diaspora ends in roughly 1888, when Brazil became the first country to outlaw slavery in the New World, although Africans were still brought to the New World, although kind of as unfree laborers, but indentured servants after Brazil abolished slavery. So, you have this kind of 400-year period of the African diaspora.
That's actually over 400 years and a really long time.
Yeah, it really is. I see it as being much longer than most historians kind of bookend it.
That's really interesting. Why do you see the diaspora as lasting much longer than most other historians?
Well, most historians, I think, begin in roughly 1500 when the first slaves arrive in the New World. Whereas if you back it up to 1444, the Portuguese are bringing African people to Europe, primarily to interrogate them, to find out things about Africa. Some of them are being used as slaves or other forms of unfree labor. And then most scholars end it with the end of the slave trade, or at least England and America's kind of when they abolished the slave trade in 1807, or when England abolishes slavery in the 1830s. But I see it as going, again, much longer. I mean, you have slaves illegally smuggled into the United States up into 1860, when the Union blockaded the South during the Civil War, and Cuba and Brazil continued to import slaves into the 1860s in the case of Cuba, legally. And then in Brazil, up until 1880 is when Brazil abolishes slavery, but really slaves continue to be brought into Brazil up into 1888. And so I see it as this much longer process that needs to be studied.
Now, earlier you noted that the African diaspora refers to a massive dislocation of peoples. Just how big of a dislocation are we talking about? How many people were removed from Africa during the diaspora?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, it's still up for debate. Scholars have typically settled on about 11 to 12 million people, but again, it depends on what endpoint they're using for considering the end of slavery. So if you're considering kind of an earlier date, 1807 or sometime in the 1830s, you're closer to 11.5 million. But if you take it up into the late 1800s, then you're looking at more like 12 million people forcibly transplanted to the New World.
But even if we're talking about an estimate on the low end, we're still talking about 11 million people. So do we have any idea, or I guess I should say, do we have any ideas of how this forced movement of African peoples impacted or influenced the broader Atlantic world?
I would argue that it's massive, that colonialism and the success of plantation slavery really hinged on the movement of these peoples. I mean, even if you're taking a low number, the 11.5 million, and you compare that to the number of Europeans, which is, I believe, around 2 million that arrive in the New World, Africans end up comprising roughly 70-75% of all the people that crossed the Atlantic Ocean from the old world to the new. And so just thinking in numbers, in kind of quantitative numbers, that's significant. And then the role they play, I mean, they're the ones who are providing much of the labor that produces the capital that's going to make colonialism and plantation slavery profitable for European powers. And then you also have to consider that they're not just arriving as kind of mindless laborers, but just as migrants or just as immigrants try to recreate their cultural practices, enslaved Africans sought to recreate their cultural practices to provide their lives with a sense of meaning and purpose and value. So they end up recreating traditions for themselves and in the process insinuating their practices upon their enslavers or making their traditions so appealing that their enslavers willingly adopt them.
Now, one of the cultural attributes that Africans brought with them to North America and the broader Atlantic world was aquatic culture. In fact, in Undercurrents of Power, Kevin makes the case that we need to better understand African aquatic culture because we can't get a full picture of early American history or Atlantic history if we just look at land events and sea events. So, Kevin, would you tell us more about this idea you have and why you think we need to explore the people of North America and the Atlantic world as both land people and water people?
I think that's a really important point and a central point, as you mentioned. One thing that scholars have argued correctly for a long time is that you can't understand human circumstances without understanding the environment that people are living in. They argue that cities defined urban slavery in many ways, that fields defined agricultural bondage, that mines informed the experiences of enslaved miners. And so water covers roughly 70% of the Earth's surface. It was and is cheaper to move things and people by boat rather than to go overland. Most plantations were built near waterways to facilitate the movement of slave-produced cash crops to markets. Similarly, rivers, coastlines, and lakes are prominent geographic features in Atlantic Africa. And so I make the argument that you need to consider the entire space that was known to Africans, both in Africa and in the New World, and that we shouldn't impose these artificial binaries on human experiences and say, well, people either lived maritime or terrestrial lives by assuming that people were either farmers or fishermen. If you look closely at sources, whether you're looking at the experiences of Africans or slaves in the New World, and also I should say people of European descent, many Africans were both farming fishermen and fishing farmers. And so in Africa, it was not at all uncommon. Actually, it was, I think, pretty typical for people to fish one season and farm another, and then use dugout canoes to take crops to market. During warfare, people fought on land and in boats. And so to try and draw a distinction just ignores the lived experience of people.
And just to explore this interesting point a bit more, what do you think historians miss if they focus their studies just on how people engaged with each other on land or water instead of on land and water?
Yeah, so it really misses a lot of important things. It misses the ways that people could provide, in this case, how slaves could provide their lives with this sense of meaning. So you have slaves, for example, competing in swimming matches, in going out and engaging in blood sport and fighting marine creatures and killing them. And the honor that's gained in the water, under the water, is carried ashore. It's not as if the honor that's gained in a swim match is then kind of isolated within that sphere in the water. It has these palpable meanings ashore. If you look at enslaved women, they're growing crops in their free time in little vegetable gardens outside of their cabins. And then they're using boats to take those crops to market. And they're selling those crops, and they're fishing, and they're selling those fish in urban markets to white consumers. And then they're taking that money home, and they're using it to make the lives of their enslaved family members better by buying better food, by buying clothing and jewelry and gifts and all sorts of things that are going to make their oppressed lives somewhat more comfortable.
Those are really interesting points, and they do indicate that maybe we should consider land and water together when we explore the past. Now, as we do know a lot about land events, I really think we should spend some time considering water culture. So, Kevin, what relationship did the African and African-descended peoples you researched have with water? Would you tell us a bit about how water featured into their daily lives and cultures?
It's really kind of braided into many aspects of their daily lives. So people oftentimes, again, you have somebody who might be a farmer part of the year, and then he's also going to be a fisherman. And then he'll help build his own dugout canoe, which he'll man when he goes fishing. And his wife and children might use that canoe then to take crops to the local market. People early on learn to swim. The accounts indicate that when children were a few months to about a year old, they began learning how to swim. And so this allows them to understand how water moves in really kind of nuanced ways. And so they began to then use those understandings of water to earn livings, right? So they're going to set fishing traps. If canoes overturned, they're going to dive down and collect goods that had fallen out of their canoes. And they use swimming to swim into battle, to silently cross rivers if they're going to engage enemy. And so it has all of these sorts of kind of practical reasons, but then also water had a lot of spiritual meaning. Bodies of water were thought to be inhabited by water spirits or by deities. Many societies believed that the realm of the dead lay under a large river or under the ocean or across a large river or across an ocean. Water had a number of spiritual as well as economic and pragmatic meanings for people living throughout Atlantic Africa.
So, given the importance of water to African life, how exactly did Africans acquire the aquatic skills and cultures that they needed to live in and around water?
One of the things I think that's important for understanding this is just understanding the geography. The geography of Africa, I think, is much different than the geography of the New World. It's different and it's also similar. It's semi-tropical, so it's similar in those ways. But water in many important ways dominates much of Africa. I mean, again, you have these massive rivers. Some of them are several miles wide and hundreds of miles long. And then you have tsetse flies, which made it really difficult for Africans to use draft animals because tsetse flies tended to kill draft animals, whether it's cattle, horses, camels, relatively quickly. So the only way to really move about in many places in much of Atlantic Africa was either on foot or by water. And so Africans realized that, they had these massive river systems and thousands of miles of coastline, and they could stitch these together to create vast trading systems as well as cultural systems. And so as they're moving about trading goods, they're exchanging also cultural practices, cultural values, and creating a community of communities that are, again, stitched together by these waterways, these natural waterways.
Now, when we explore the cultures of people who lived mostly on land, we typically see gender differences in the ways that they divided the work of the household and public life. And I wonder, is the same true for African aquatic cultures? Were there divisions or differences in aquatic roles based on gender or perhaps even based on age?
There were, but not to the same extent that there was in Western society. So, it was fine for men and for women in African society to use canoes. Maritime skills weren't considered gender specific in many ways. Women from an early age learned how to man canoes. They learned how to swim, how to dive. And so European travel accounts indicate that women were really strong swimmers, that they oftentimes could outswim African men and they could outdive African men. They could dive to greater depths than African men. And accounts also indicate that African women were paddling canoes to go fishing, paddling canoes to go to market. And so they tended not to engage in, at least according to sources, I mean, if you're looking for gender specifics, in maritime warfare or even in amphibious warfare like men did. But nonetheless, water was not regarded as the kind of exclusive domain of men. Now, there were some gender segregation when it came to beaches to an extent. So what I mean by that is that men and women swam together, and they oftentimes swam nude together, but there were certain beaches along riverways and along coastal areas which were segregated by gender because these were beaches or waterscapes where women bathed. Bathing and swimming oftentimes occurred together, but at these particular beaches, only women were allowed because they were primarily used for women to bathe as well as to socialize and to swim in.
You briefly mentioned Western societies, and when we do look at the history of the Atlantic world, we see that this world did bring all sorts of different peoples to live and mix together, like Europeans and Africans. Could you tell us about the differences in the relationships that African and African American peoples had with water versus the relationships that Europeans and Euro-American colonists had with water?
Yeah, and that's a really, I think, important point that maybe we can develop a little bit more as we go on. But one of the differences is that Europeans tended to view water as an unnatural space for human beings. And so they saw the ocean in many ways as the remnants of kind of the chaos that existed before God imposed order on the world. And so they were willing to use ships to cross the ocean, but they weren't also willing to really swim. They saw swimming in many ways as this kind of savage pursuit, as animalistic. And this is something that animals did, that they regarded Africans as being less civilized, as savage. And so Africans' ability to swim, they saw, was proof of African savagery. And so they weren't, in large part, really willing to become strong, proficient swimmers. And so some Europeans could swim if they kind of waded into a waterway and slowly entered the water. But sources indicate that during any sort of maritime disaster, if they fell off a dock, if they fell off a boat and were submerged, they oftentimes had a lot of difficulty just resurfacing and tended to drown. Yeah, so there were these big differences in why they stopped swimming. And a lot of the reasons why they stopped swimming, I guess I should touch on that a little bit, is that with the rise of Christianity, church officials felt that swimming was immodest because most people swam nude. And there's also changes in warfare that favored knights that wore armor. That really discouraged swimming because, you obviously can't swim if you're wearing armor. And so you see ancient European swimming, but then during the Middle Ages, you really see a falling off of swimming because of these Christian beliefs, changes in warfare, also changes in medical theory. The theory was that the body was made up of four humors: liquid, solid, heat, and cold, and that if one immersed themselves in water, water would actually penetrate their body and would cause sickness, which is why doctors would bleed people. They felt that they had too much fluid. And so they would reduce some of this fluid by either cutting somebody or by putting bleaches on them.
So, given the European and Euro-American reluctance to immerse themselves in water, it really seems like Africans and African-descended peoples possess some really good skills, like the ability to swim, and Europeans couldn't swim. Now, as knowledge is often power, would you tell us about the ways that free and enslaved Africans and African-descended peoples may have used their aquatic knowledge, like the ability to swim, to their advantage?
Yeah, so a really good, I think, way of looking at this is that Europeans had this assumption that technology would triumph over traditional ways. And so if you look at salvage diving, they believed that if you had a diving bell or if you created some sort of a diving suit, that would actually allow Europeans to outperform Africans, that it precluded the need to actually swim, and that you could just lower this diving bell down and people could kind of pick things up off of these wrecks. There's a lot of false assumptions there. I mean, one of the problems is it was really difficult to lower a diving bell over a newer wreck that still had its mast and sails intact because, these things got in the way of actually reaching the hull of the ship. A diving bell also prevented people from actually entering a ship. I mean, if you couldn't swim, you still couldn't get into the deck. So you could pick up things off the top of the deck, but you couldn't actually access it. And so they put too much weight in actually this sort of technology. And so Africans, with their ability to what's called free diving or diving with just the air in their lungs, could go down. They could enter ships' hulls. They could break open hulls. They could go into ships' cabins and in the process recover tons of, sometimes 20 tons or 30 tons of gold and silver and other commodities from shipwrecks. And they could do this, importantly, in a few weeks or a month or so. And so their ability to produce all of this capital in a relatively short amount of time provided them with a really surprising amount of leverage that allowed many of these enslaved divers to live while they remained enslaved as if they were free in many ways. And what I mean by that is they were paid. They received both a wage and they received a share of what they recovered. And this allowed many of them to actually purchase their own freedom. They were treated well. They were treated better than the white sailors. They were treated probably on par with white ship officers in that they were not physically punished because white salvagers understood that if you beat a diver, that might render a diver unfit to actually work. And so, yeah, they ended up receiving some really unique privileges.
Yeah. And it also seems like African free divers would have had a greater sense of autonomy, too. I mean, they had a better ability to move around underwater because they were able to use the air in their lungs and measure it out so that they could get into places. Whereas the Europeans using diving bells, well, those diving bells were cumbersome and they would have restricted their movement underwater a great deal.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the diving bell was extremely cumbersome. It was difficult to use. It required the ocean to be really calm. Otherwise, it could actually capsize the boat that had the diving bell hanging from it. I mean, these diving bells weighed 1,000 pounds to a ton or more. And so, you have an arm sticking off the side of a boat and then this bell with all this weight, and they were really difficult to use. And so that imposed other problems. I mean, another thing I think that's really important to think about here is that gendered or Western concepts of gendered labor actually end up providing Africans with even more leverage. And what I mean by that is that there were hundreds, probably thousands of enslaved African women who could have served as salvage divers. But enslavers felt that the maritime world was a man's world. And so by not allowing Black women to dive, they limited the pool of divers that they could use. And so this gave enslaved male divers even more leverage because they understood that they were a rare commodity. And they negotiated that and they manipulated their enslavers in order to force their enslavers to treat them better I would argue, than if there was a much larger pool of divers, which there would have been if they had included women.
You know, it occurs to me that we've been talking about this diving bell quite a bit, and we really haven't described it. So I wonder if you would describe it for us so that we have a better idea of what it looked like and how it really restricted underwater movement for those who used it.
Yeah, so in many ways, they either looked like a church bell or a cylinder, and they were incredibly cramped. There wasn't a lot of room to move about in them. Inside, there would have been about 3 or 4 feet of height, and then you would have to imagine that they're slanting inward at the top as you go up. And so oftentimes they'd have 2 people in there, and quite literally, they'd be resting forehead to forehead against each other or otherwise in really close proximity. And oftentimes they were so small that only half of a diver's body would have been above water. So their legs would have been below water as they're lowering these things. And one of the real problems with them was that they were relying on sailors in ships above to actually pump oxygen with billows down into these diving bells. And a lot of times, sailors just stopped pumping air for some reason or other, and the divers would just die. They would suffocate in these diving bells, not being able to surface. They would just run out of oxygen and die. And so there were a number of problems using them.
So they were kind of like primitive submarines.
Really crude submarines that you would not want to go in.
Awesome. Well, thanks for helping us better understand that technology. Now, to return to free diving, how did African and African Americans learn to dive? Diving is an intensive activity, so how and when did they learn all the skills that they needed to do it?
Yeah, and this is, I think, a really important point in that what seems to have happened is that many of them were skilled at swimming and diving before they were enslaved. And there's historical evidence, that slave traders were actually targeting people with swimming skills so that they could bring them to the New World and sell them as divers. And so free diving, or this process of diving beneath the surface with only the air in your lungs, is a skill that takes some time to develop. It usually began during childhood. And so people are just kind of doing this casually. They're swimming and diving, playing as children. And as they realized that they had these skills, they might have dove for other reasons in Africa, whether it was just to dive down to harvest shellfish or to recover goods off of the bottom of a river or in coastal waterways. They increasingly built up their capacities through childhood and adolescence. And one of the things that I think is important for understanding why Europeans targeted Africans with diving skills is that free diving in some ways is like athletic training in altitude, where oxygen apnea or being deprived of oxygen underwater and underwater pressure begins to change a diver's physiology. It begins to make people's bodies process oxygen more efficiently to actually store more oxygen in their blood. Actually, prolonged underwater exposure actually makes people's eyesight significantly better than people who don't normally dive. And so their physiology seems to have actually adapted to underwater diving. And so this made them, again, kind of targets for it. And then in the New World, the accounts indicate that there were, among salvage divers and pearl divers, that there were apprentices who I suspect were divers. Many of them, I would suspect anyway, were divers' sons or nephews or other slaves, obviously. And so they would have acquired underwater diving skills by watching skilled male divers and gradually picking up their techniques.
When we think about slavery in the Americas, we really tend to think about plantations or possibly even urban spaces. So where in the Americas were colonists looking for enslaved people with diving skills? And how would the colonists have sought to make use of these enslaved people's skills?
Yeah, so they're looking for them in several different places for several different reasons. So the Spanish were the first to use enslaved divers, and they began using them in the early 1500s to dive for pearls. And so they had been forcing indigenous Americans to dive for pearls off what's known as the Pearl Coast, which is off the northern coast of South America and some coastal islands. And so overwork and disease began to kill off this indigenous population. And so they began then to import Africans, primarily from the Senegambia, which is the northernmost region of sub-Saharan Africa, of Atlantic Africa. So they began importing them, and then also people from the Gold Coast, or what's now modern-day Ghana, to dive for pearls there. And from them, then the English and the Dutch and the French realized that they could actually use divers to salvage shipwrecks. And so there's some early accounts from the 1540s of Africans being taken to Europe to salvage European shipwrecks. And then colonists began using them during the 1600s to salvage goods in primarily the Northern Caribbean, the Bahamas, and Bermuda. And the reason why English and French and Dutch colonists began using them is that the Spanish would amass their wealth in Cuba, in Havana, and then they send out these treasure fleets once or twice a year, usually oftentimes once a year in late summer or early fall. And this is hurricane season. And so they're sailing out from Cuba, and in order to reach the open waters of the Atlantic, they had to sail along the coast of Florida or through the Bahamas. And there are numerous instances in which entire fleets would sail out, and then within a few days, they actually end up inadvertently sailing right into a hurricane, and the entire fleet would go down. And so then these became rich pickings for English colonists who were looking for ways to produce capital.
Now, another valuable aquatic skill that African and African Americans possessed was knowledge about canoes, how to build them, how to handle them, and how to use them to master their waterscapes. Kevin, canoes are something that we just tend to associate with Native Americans, not Africans. So after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, I really hope you'll tell us more about the canoes and canoe traditions of African and African American peoples. As you can tell from this episode, the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios team and I work really hard to bring you interesting explorations of early American life. In doing so, we rely on your episode requests and your feedback. So please help us serve you better with this podcast by taking our listener survey. You can take the survey at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. In this brief survey, you can tell us what you think about the show, what you'd like to see changed, and provide us feedback on how we're doing. Again, our survey can be taken at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. That's benfranklinsworld.com/survey. Thank you so much for your help. Kevin, we'd love to know more about the canoes and canoe traditions of African and African American peoples. So would you tell us more about these traditions and these watercraft?
Africans have this really rich tradition of building dugout canoes that's probably several thousand years old. And while it is true that Indigenous Americans built canoes, the canoes that Africans built were much different in design than those that were built by Native Americans. And doing the research for the book, I had to actually consider the designs because there had been this assumption that Native Americans taught Africans how to build canoes. And so one of the things that I first began to do was to try and figure out if you could actually distinguish African canoes from Native American canoes by looking at tool marks on dugout canoes, because Native Americans only had stone tools, whereas Africans had iron tools. And so I realized early on that it was going to be pretty difficult to determine if the tool marks on a canoe were made by a stone or an iron tool. And so then I began to focus much more on the canoe design, and they have really distinct features. So basically, Native Americans built canoes primarily with fire. So they had stone tools, they had shells that they could use, but from the beginning of the process to the end, they're using fire. They're using fire to fell the tree, to shorten the tree, using controlled fires to shorten the tree, to burn off two ends of the tree, using it to hollow out a tree, and using stone tools to move the fire about as they're hollowing out the center. And so as they are doing this, the canoes that they ended up making ended up retaining a lot of the features of a tree. So they tended to be very round, kind of blunt shape at both ends, and relatively thick. I mean, they're thick, I suspect, because using fire and stone tools to make a canoe could take Indigenous people months or even a year to make a canoe. Whereas Africans using iron tools could make a canoe in a few days, or a really large canoe in a few weeks. And by a large canoe, I mean a canoe that could be upwards of 100, maybe 120 feet in length and capable of carrying over 100 warriors or several tons of cargo. And these canoes, the hull of the canoe would be very thin. I mean, they could pare them down so that they were only an inch or two thick, and they were very streamlined. I mean, they came to a very distinct point in the bow, and the stern was slightly more rounded. So the design really varied much more than I think previous scholars had assumed. So it's pretty easy to distinguish a traditional African canoe from a traditional Amerindian canoe.
Okay, so if Africans had this really deep tradition of building canoes, a tradition that goes back several thousand years, how did the idea that Native Americans introduced Africans to canoes come about?
Yeah, so I think it goes to a few different assumptions or false assumptions. One of them is that this assumption by early historians, by kind of early 20th century historians and other scholars, was that Africans were backwards, that they had nothing of merit and value to offer to the rest of the world. And so the canoes that they saw slaves using, the technology and the techniques for making these canoes, it must have been taught to them by Native Americans. I mean, dugout canoes were not something that Europeans were making. And so the assumption was, well, Africans were just too dumb to make them, so Native Americans must have taught them. I think another thing that was driving it is the type of canoes that we as Americans use as children. So the canoes that I used when I went to like YMCA camp or Boy Scout camp are based on a Native American design, and not even a dugout canoe design, but those aluminum canoes that I used as a kid, and they're now mostly plastic or fiberglass, are based on the design of birch bark canoes. And so the assumption is that's what a canoe looked like. And when historians, I think, looked at images of canoes that had a much more pointed bow and stern, they said, well, that's what a canoe looks like. But the assumption, again, was that canoes were based on an Amerindian prototype. And so those canoes that they're looking at in historical images, again, must have been designed by or based on an Amerindian as opposed to an African design.
So Africans really had a deep canoe culture before they ever came to North America, which begs the question, what aspects of their canoe cultures did they bring with them to North America during the African diaspora?
I would argue virtually all of it. And so one of the things to understanding a canoe is that you can't just go use any kind of tree as a canoe. I mean, in a pinch, you could use many different types of trees, but certain types of trees possessed qualities that made them less resistant to rot, less resistant to bug infestation. One of those types of trees are cottonwoods, and they're indigenous to both Africa and to the New World. And so while there are different varieties of trees, sources suggest that Africans understood that, if they're arriving in the tropical New World and they saw dugout canoes, that they readily understood they could use those sorts of trees. So they would have also, though, had to have some kind of conversation, I think, or I suspect, with Native Americans, where Native Americans, say, in the American South, were telling them what sort of trees would be resistant to bug infestation, to dry rot, and these sorts of things. And perhaps African canoe makers or enslaved African canoe makers then taught Native Americans how to use iron tools. I suspect there was this kind of exchange of knowledge. But importantly, the trees that Africans were using, the different types of trees, were oftentimes thought of as being sacred. Different ethnic groups had different beliefs, but members of many ethnic groups felt that cottonwood trees were the souls of unborn children waiting to be born. And they felt that these cottonwood trees, which are these tall, really straight trees, actually connected the earth and the sky together. And if you took this tree and put it on the water as a dugout canoe, the canoe could actually be a mechanism for connecting with the spirit world. Again, keeping in mind that water was a sacred space and that large bodies of water were the residence of water deities. And so there's all these kind of spiritual values woven into dugout canoes, into the making of dugout canoes. Professional canoe making was oftentimes enshrouded in a spiritual meaning. And so before a tree was felled, sacrifices had to be made to the spirits residing in that tree. They basically had to ask the spirits for permission to fell that tree to make it into a canoe. And so you see enslaved Africans in the New World carrying on these traditions and treating canoes as sacred spaces that also had secular meaning. Canoes, both in Africa and the New World, also had a gender. A gender was determined by how a canoe rode across the water. A canoe had a soul, basically, and fishermen would make sacrifices to the canoe's soul, and then the soul of that canoe would guide them to schools of fish. Maritime merchants would similarly make sacrifices to canoes, and the canoes would guide them then around treacherous waterways, around rapids. or through rapids, around pirates and other maritime dangers in order to ensure profitable trading voyages.
Now, as African canoes and canoe traditions came to North America, in what ways did slaveholders try to take advantage of that fact? And in what ways did Africans and African Americans use their canoe skills to take advantage of slaveholders?
What the sources suggest is that slaveholders understood early on that canoes were a relatively cheap and easy way for them to ship slave-produced cash crops from plantations to ports. And so what I mean by that is that in order to do that, you really needed a lot of specialized tools and specialized labor. And colonists didn't have those. I mean, there weren't large numbers of boat builders or shipbuilders that were going to the New World. And they understood, I mean, they saw Africans making dugout canoes. So while there were professional canoe makers in Africa that made really large canoes, or canoes that were specifically designed for crossing through the surf, called surf canoes, many people knew how to make smaller canoes that might range in size from 6 feet to 15 feet. And so they saw slaves building these canoes and fishing during their free time and realized that these canoes could be used to connect them to ports. And they also realized that canoes had a number of other kind of navigational abilities that ships and boats didn't have, in that canoes don't have a keel. And so what this meant is there's not this keel protruding down from the bottom of a canoe. And so canoes could actually, you could place in many canoes, a 15, 20-foot canoe was capable of holding 800 pounds, maybe a ton. A slightly larger canoe could hold several tons, 2 tons, 3 tons, and it could still pass through inches or a foot or so of water. So this gave canoes a really distinct advantage over Western-style boats, in that they could navigate the shallows of the American South relatively easily, that they could be paddled much more quickly and much more efficiently than a European-style rowboat. So all of these things gave canoes advantages over Western-style boats.
We've talked a lot about the aquatic skills that Africans and African Americans possessed and how those skills were really advantageous, how they were really skills and knowledge that people wanted. So how did slaveholders who wanted access to these skills and access to this knowledge go about trying to find enslaved Africans who possess these skills?
So that's a really good question, and I don't know entirely. I mean, it's one of those questions that in some ways remains unanswered. One of the ways I suspect that they ended up finding, say, skilled divers is just by watching slaves' recreational practices. So they would see slaves swimming and realize that maybe these people had underwater diving skills, or they might see them fighting marine creatures during blood sport, fighting crocodiles or alligators in the American South, American alligators or American crocodiles or sharks. And so they would understand that they had those skills. They also realized that Africans had the ability to make dugout canoes because they would see Africans building dugout canoes in their free time, and then these Africans are using them to go fishing and things like that. And at first, the kind of knee-jerk reaction among slaveholders was to stop them from building canoes, because they realized that by building canoes, this made slaves much more mobile, that slaves could take these canoes out at night and go visit family members living on distant plantations. They could use these canoes to run away and to do all these things. And they realized that, look, they can't actually stop them from making canoes. They found it really impossible, and slaves found ways of hiding canoes. And so what they ended up doing then was trying to appropriate it. And so they would actually encourage slaves to build canoes. And what you see is oftentimes slaves that were proficient in making canoes were rewarded by also making them plantation carpenters. So a slaveholder might not need a canoe to be made every year, but they would need other things to be made out of wood. And they realized that these carpentry skills that canoe makers had could be used to build houses. Some were used to build Western-style boats, Western-style ships in some instances, furniture, everything else that a carpenter would do.
What do you think the overall impact of all these various aquatic skills had on the American institution of slavery? Do you think these skills added to its economic output and to the culture that developed around American slavery?
Yeah, so I think it's actually quite dramatic and quite profound. And in some ways, I don't think I actually capture it in the book. And it kind of is providing this opportunity for me to look at more things in the future. But one of the things that I would argue, and that I've mentioned already, is that these canoe makers and canoe men, enslaved canoe men, were really crucial for linking plantation slavery to wider Atlantic markets. I mean, we oftentimes don't think about how these slave-produced cash crops reached overseas markets or reached ports. And much of these slave-produced commodities did so in the hulls of dugout canoes. So you have enslaved canoemen using African-style dugout canoes to paddle boatloads of sugar, tobacco, indigo, rice, cotton to ports. And then in these ports, slave owners are then buying things that are going to make plantation slavery more efficient or that are just necessary, including slaves. And so these canoemen then return to plantations bearing these accoutrements of slavery, including subsequent generations of enslaved Africans. And one of the other things I think that's really important and that I'm probably going to begin looking at in more depth in subsequent research is the capital that these underwater divers produced and what it was used for. In this book, I was much more focused on kind of the cultural aspects of aquatics. But these slaves, as I mentioned, the slaves that are employed by English salvagers, for instance, they're raising tons of gold and silver from a single shipwreck. And so one of the things that becomes apparent is that the spending patterns of the white salvagers who are using these slaves, they're using these things to actually buy plantations, quite often not in the same colony. A white Bermudian salvage operator would then use the wealth that he accumulated from a wreck to buy a plantation in Jamaica or Barbados or Antigua. Or one of the things also that I realized is that Barbadian planters would send their divers to shipwrecks in the Bahamas or off the African coast to recover goods and then use that capital to expand plantation production in Barbados. By placing water in the center of this study, I'm really able to look at kind of all of these different or number of different ways that aquatics connected people to distant and to near terrestrial places.
Kevin, I wonder if you would tell us how you think a better understanding of African and African American aquatic skills might help us develop a better understanding of early America's slave past.
Yeah, so one of the things I think that's really important is that African American swimming past really cuts against the grain of common assumptions and swimming practices within American communities as well as within America itself. I mean, in the United States today, swimming is oftentimes thought of being a white activity or an unblack activity. And these assumptions have discouraged large numbers of African Americans from swimming with really tragic results. What it's meant is that African Americans are at least 6 times more likely than white Americans to drown because they view swimming as unblack and not really something that Black people should be doing. And so what I've been doing since the publication of some articles and then also since the publication of this book is working with swimming advocates to use my scholarship to dispel this assumption that swimming is somehow unblack and to really shine a spotlight on the African traditions of swimming in America and that swimming should be something that African Americans are proud to engage in.
Let's move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if Africans had not brought their deep aquatic culture and powerful aquatic skills to North America? How would the history of early America be different?
I think that's a good way of looking at why or considering why we need to understand people's relationship between land and water. If we just think of slavery as occurring ashore, we miss the important contribution that enslaved Africans made in moving these slave-produced cash crops to market. So it's true that the millions of slaves that were forced to produce cash crops in fields mightily contributed to the capital that slavery and colonialism generated. But all of that wealth would have been for naught if it was not for enslaved canoemen who then moved those goods from plantations to ports or from plantations directly out to ships that had sailed up rivers, up the Cooper River in South Carolina or up other rivers. So you have these enslaved canoemen then bringing goods directly from plantations out into the Chesapeake and loading them directly onto ships that then are taking them to the American North or to Europe. And so this is, I think, really important in an area that remains unexplored.
So, Kevin, what's your next project? What aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
And so I'm taking kind of a little bit lighter approach, if you will. I mean, studying slavery can be oppressive and heavy to consider. And so one of the things that I'm working on now is looking at how surfing in Africa and Oceania shaped Western beach and surf culture. And Oceania is basically the South Pacific. It's Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. And so what I'm looking at is how you have this shift where Europeans didn't value beaches and didn't value swimming and surfing and saw swimming and surfing as being kind of savage and beneath them. And so I'm looking now at what inspired Europeans to take the plunge, what inspired them to strip out of their layers of clothes that they felt civilized their bodies, to dress more like these people that they regarded for centuries as uncivilized, and to swim and to surf. And so another thing I'm also looking at is how slaves shaped saltwater foodways or Western seafood culture. And so you have enslaved fishermen and women using African fishing techniques to catch fish and shellfish for themselves to augment the rations that their owners were providing, and also slave owners requiring enslaved men to catch fish for them and shellfish for them. And then these men and women, they take this seafood and enslaved women prepare it for their families. And they also prepared it for their owners. And so you have African women using seafood, incorporating seafood into African-influenced dishes like gumbos and jambalayas, then making these staples on southern plantations. And then not only on southern plantations, but they also recipes for these African-influenced dishes begin to appear in early American cookbooks. And then as restaurant culture develops in America in the mid-1800s, these African-influenced dishes begin to appear on restaurant menus. And so this is one of the things that I'm also looking at now.
And what's the best way to contact you if we should have more questions about African and African-American aquatic cultures?
One of the ways would be to just Google me. That's an easy way. I have a website. It's faculty.ucmerced.edu/KDawson4. But I think the easiest way is if you just Google Kevin Dawson, and there's a professional soccer player named Kevin Dawson, and there's me.
Kevin Dawson, thank you so much for joining us and for helping us consider African water culture and its implications for early American culture and society.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really hope that it can inspire people to begin looking more deeply at African and African American aquatic traditions.
The African diaspora was the massive dislocation of two peoples. Native Americans, who were forced off their lands to make space for European and Euro-American plantations and settlement, and enslaved Africans, who were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to make those European and Euro-American plantations and settlements profitable. Now, historians differ quite a bit as to when they date the diaspora. Kevin noted that he thinks it started in 1444, while other historians begin the event closer to 1500. Historians also use different events to end the diaspora. Those dates range from 1807 to the 1880s. And the date range for the diaspora really matters, because it's the date range that determines how many people we think were forcibly relocated during the event. And that estimate ranges from 11 million people to 12 million people. Now, 11 to 12 million people is a lot of people, especially when we think how there were just 2 million Europeans who moved across the Atlantic. This means that Africans comprise 70 to 75% of all the people who moved across the Atlantic between 1450 and the mid-19th century, which means it's really natural that a lot of African culture and ideas would have made their way to the Americas and the Caribbean and influenced their development. And one aspect of African culture that had a big impact on colonial America was water culture. Africans knew how to swim. They knew how to build and handle canoes and other watercraft. They knew how to free dive by regulating the air in their lungs as they swam to greater depths and then resurfaced very carefully. The outcome of all these skills is that slaveholders used and appropriated African knowledge to move goods from plantations to markets, to connect settlements together via waterways, and to generate large amounts of wealth from wreck and pearl diving. Swimming, diving, fishing, and boat building and handling were everyday activities for many of the African people who found themselves in the Americas and the Caribbean. They then used these everyday activities and skills to impact and shape the new world around them. And although these activities are no longer seen as Black or African American activities, they originated as such. I hope you enjoyed our revisit with Kevin Dawson. For more information about Kevin, his book Undercurrents of Power, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we spoke about today, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/383. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, and they help their favorite podcasts out by taking their listener surveys. Please help us keep Ben Franklin's World fun and vibrant. Share your ideas in our listener survey. You can take the survey at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. That's benfranklinsworld.com/survey. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, Katie Schinnebeck, Ashley Bachnight, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, thank you for listening. I'll see you in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.